Hello and welcome to the Tune Up. I am your host, Sarah Z, and this week we are going to be talking again about anxiety, but this time we are going to focus on our long-term relationship and management of anxiety so that we can continue thriving in our life. So I hear a lot from people that suffer from chronic anxiety or panic. They feel like it gets in the way of letting them feel as successful and empowered in their life. And it frankly stops them from enjoying and living as full of a life as we all deserve, frankly. And so this week is about giving you guys some tools that you can help use to manage your anxiety long term, because let's face it, anxiety and panic, our brains are designed with that fight or flight response. It's probably not going away completely, but the everyday kind of chronic anxiety can be managed better so that we can still thrive. And what do I mean by that? I want you guys to feel successful in your careers. I want you to be able to go to work every day. I want you to be able to have fulfilling relationships with family and friends. And I want you to be able to do the things that may trigger you a little bit, but you still ultimately really want to do. If there's stuff in your life that you're like, I can live without going to an amusement park. I hate being in crowds. That's okay. But what if you really want to do those things with your family or friends or for yourself and anxiety is stopping you? I want you to have access to tools so that is no longer the case. You can empower yourself. You can kind of take care of those feelings so that you can still do the things that you want to do and feel happy and healthy and successful. And you're like, yeah, I have anxiety, but I got this. So the first up, I fully believe that knowledge is power, and it's very important for me and for my kids who also suffer from some anxiety and panic that they understand what's happening when they're anxiety and or panic. And I am going to use them interchangeably because they are pretty similar. What's happening when we're triggered. And this week I want to talk to you about 4 major effects of anxiety that it has on the brain so that you know that when you're triggered, you can understand, oh, this is a biological response. This is my brain's response. It's an overcorrection, right? A lot of the times the brain is telling you to be afraid of something that typically doesn't need a fear response. But like I said last week, it's just we have a wonky bat signal. It's signaling that we need Batman to come in and swoop in and save us, and chances are that's really not the case. So not a big deal. It's just we got kind of a wonky bat signal. But so when we're feeling anxious, our body goes on alert, and you probably already know this. It's like your brain is kind of trying to prepare itself and the body for that flight or fight mode. And in an attempt to help you fight off whatever is making yourself anxious, your brain floods your central nervous system with adrenaline and cortisol. And these hormones are what tell our body, uh-oh, whoop, 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 something scary is about to happen, which is great if you're out in the woods. And this happened to me. I heard kind of like little footsteps and I turn around and it's a coyote. I take a few more steps. I hear like kind of soft steps behind me. The coyote is getting closer. My brain was like, holy shit, we got to get the F out of here, right? So in that case, it was really helpful. My body and my brain were working together and they were like, okay, what do? I need to back up slowly. I need to get away from this coyote that's kind of stalking me, thinking that I'm its like Happy Meal, right? But sometimes our brain is doing that and there really isn't anything to be afraid of, or there isn't anything that ultimately we need to manage in a way. It's not an extreme is what I'm trying to say. And so unfortunately, in a non-anxious brain, once the danger is gone, the sympathetic part of our nervous system, so like once I was away from the coyote, the nervous system can then take over because the threat is gone and it can calm us down. However, but when we suffer from anxiety and we have that kind of chronic sense of anxiety, we don't have that sense of calm. That's the part we never get back our equilibrium. Instead, the rush of hormones causes our brain to release even more stress hormones. So it's, again, we're overcorrecting. We're a little bit of an overachiever with this brain activity. And then we're so inundated with these stress hormones, we're then just overwhelmed. And it happens again and again and again. And then our baseline level of anxiety increases. And so you go from having anxiety every once in a while to having it on a day-to-day basis, right? And then it can sometimes be severe, where it's really interrupting how we live our lives. Anxiety also makes our brain super hyperactive to threats. So when you deal with anxiety on a consistent basis, it's actually changing our brain. Our amygdala grows larger. And if you don't know what that is, the amygdala is that tiny almond-shaped structure that's located in the limbic system, and it deals with our emotions and our moods. So I like to think of the amygdala as kind of like the brain's watchman, right? I don't know if you guys watched the Disney video animated show, What's This? Basically it's like the guy who's like watching everything, but he's not typically supposed to intervene. He's just like kind of staying on the lookout and seeing what's happening. But part of its function though is it does notice danger or threats. And when it does notice the potential danger, it signals to the hypothalamus to trigger that fight or flight response. So they kind of work together. And so in our anxious brain, we're overachievers, our amygdala is large and hypersensitive. And unfortunately, it's like that first car I got that had a car alarm that was just a little too sensitive, and it was kind of always going off when the wind was, we have these Santa Anas in California. The wind's a little too strong, it's setting off the car alarm, right? And so it sends a lot of false alarms. So your brain starts to sense threats even in non-threatening situations. And that's why sometimes when you suffer from chronic anxiety, we start to feel a little, just disconnected from our family and friends, because we're trying to explain how we're feeling, right? We're like, oh, I'm just so anxious about going to the market because there's so many people there. And they're like, what do you mean? Going to the market's like an everyday thing. It's not a big deal. Like, what's the problem? And that's because my brain, like for example, now crowds over like 5 to 10 people make me anxious. And it's not a threatening situation for most people, but my brain is like, whoop, whoop, this is scary as shit, right? And so we tend to feel threatened more often than someone who doesn't suffer from kind of that chronic anxiety. Another thing it does is it makes it harder for our brain to reason rationally. So unfortunately, it weakens the connection between our amygdala, who really loves the hypothalamus, it loves to trigger that fight or flight, but it's having kind of issues with the prefrontal cortex. Like they should probably go into marriage counseling, because when the amygdala alerts the brain to danger, the prefrontal cortex should kick in and be like, whoa, slow your roll. It's okay. Here's a rational, logical response. Like, okay, you're worried about being in crowds. Maybe you should go at atypical times throughout the day so that you're dealing with less people versus never going grocery shopping again, right? So it's kind of like your rational friend that you go to when you're freaking out, and they're like, okay, well, let's try this instead. And so they're supposed to help us kind of process the information more analytically to make more informed decisions and actually solve our problems, right? Now, when we're not anxious, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, they're working great. It's like a really good marriage. But in an anxious brain, the amygdala is like, alert, alert, alert. But the PFC, it's not quite getting the signal. It's like, what are you talking about? This is going to the grocery. This is not a problem. What's up, dude? So it's kind of like that friend that just doesn't get it. And it's like, well, no, I am freaking out. This is a problem for me. Let's solve it. And it's really getting that kind of rational part of ourselves to kick in and help out. And then the last thing I want to talk about with regards to the brain and anxiety is, obviously, when we're anxious, our body is under a lot of stress. And in response to that stress, it actually shrinks the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain that focuses on and processes long-term and contextual memory. So when that shrinks, it's kind of like, we kind of contract when we're afraid. And you can actually feel that even in like your physical body. Like when we're afraid, we try to make ourselves as small as possible typically. Like we tend to kind of fold in on ourselves. And so it makes it difficult for our brain to hold on to memory. And so the few memories that you hold on to typically then are related to the anxiety. So why this is a problem is anxiety actually wires your brain to remember failure, threat, danger, all of those kind of negative emotions. And then the happier memories, like those of when you're successful, those of when you're achieving, those are when you are safe, are buried deep in your brain's basement. They're still there, but you need to have a more active role in bringing those memories to the surface, because you have trained your brain to focus on the scary, to focus on the negative, to focus on the fear, because you've trained it to always be on and always be, it's been trained to live kind of in anxiety. Right. And, for me, I have two sisters, and anxiety, I'm like, God, when I first realized that I was suffering from anxiety and panic, it immediately was like, well, why me? Why out of the three sisters, why is this such a problem for me? Right. Like why? And honestly, there isn't, in my research, there are some predispositions to anxiety and these kind of, I don't want to call them disorders, but they're basically, it's disordered thinking, right? And it's kind of glitches in the brain and the brain chemistry. And, there are some medical causes that anxiety can actually be kind of an early warning system for other underlying health issues. So for example, you may have anxiety and it's kind of a precursor to like heart disease, diabetes, thyroid issues, drug misuse, chronic pain, things like that. But there's also some risk factors. And I think it's important to know that, know this, especially if your kids are kind of dealing with these issues, because I feel like our kids have with the pandemic and coming out of lockdown and coming out of these things, they're coming through a traumatic event. And so I think it's important to know that trauma is a precursor to like an anxiety disorder or a panic disorder. And so, not just children, adults too, dealing with the coronavirus and the pandemic has really been traumatic for a lot of people. And so we are going to see anxiety and panic continue to affect more and more people. Also stress buildup, our personality. Some people are just kind of born with personality types that are more prone to anxiety disorders. And then, if we misuse drugs or alcohol or our even our diet and lifestyle aren't what they could be, we aren't just, our brain isn't performing as optimally as it can be. And I feel like genetics play a large role. My grandmother on my mother's side certainly dealt with a lot of anxiety and worried thinking for the entire time that I knew her and probably before. And so it makes sense that, one of us out of the three was definitely going to get a little bit of the anxious gene. But I bring that up because I think it's important to know that, one, everyone's got something, right? Like everyone's, whether it's like a physical thing they deal with or a mental thing they deal with. I just, I point out that, I point these things out because I think it's, like I said, I think it's important to have as much knowledge about anxiety and panic as you can to kind of, I feel like it just helps empower you to make decisions and deal with it in the long term. And I think it's also important to know what it is and how it manifests in ourselves. Because I know, like for me, I do have that fear-based thinking, but I have like that freak out mode. You know, my very first panic attack was in college. I got they had sent me my tuition bill to my dorm mailbox instead of to my parents. And I opened up that bill and it was the largest bill I'd ever seen in my life. And I freaked the F out. And I was like, holy shit, I did the math for like 4 years. I'm like, I'm going to be in so much debt. What the hell is this? What am I doing? And I called my parents ready to quit, right? And I panicked. And, but sometimes it's not as straightforward as that. Sometimes my panic comes out in anger. I get very angry. I feel very vulnerable. So I overcorrect with like an angry response. And I think too, you know, those of us who have littles who are dealing with this, that's something to remember. My little one definitely skews more towards the anger. That's a more comfortable place for him to live than admitting that he's afraid or that he's feeling a little vulnerable or that he may need a little bit more support. It's much easier for him to scream and yell or just kind of make himself as big personality-wise as possible to kind of distract from the fact that he is afraid, right? So it manifests differently. So like we're all kind of, we may come to having anxiety for different reasons, whether it's trauma or genetics or you have an underlying health issue. You know, it really doesn't matter. The effect, the brain, it's still that wonky, glitchy brain thing is happening. And over time, it's kind of training our brain to continue in those patterns. And it's up to us to start to notice the patterns and learn how to disrupt them. And that leads me into what I want to talk about for kind of long-term maintenance, which number one, I call it my trigger log. It's like Star Trek with Captain Kirk and his, you know, captain's log. He keeps a log of all their missions and adventures. I keep a trigger log of things that trigger my anxiety. And for a long time, I was writing it in my journal. Now I just kind of, I have a notes function in my phone. I just keep like a running list of things that trigger the new things that I discover kind of trigger the anxiety and panic that I feel. And the reason I do this is because there are going to be events that I don't want to or I can't avoid, like interviewing for a new job or meeting my in-laws for Passover dinner. You know, I don't want to miss out on those things, but I also don't want to suffer through them either. So I keep a log of, I call it my trigger log, and I keep a list of everything that kind of triggers me that I notice, right? That gives me that kind of anxious, panicky feeling. And what I do then is, as much as I can, I plan around them. I caretake before, because it's much easier to kind of bolster and create the foundation of healthy, feeling healthy and confident before you're in the event, right? Like once you're in it and triggered, it's not too late, because there's definitely things that we can do when we're in a panic attack. But ultimately, I think it's easier to kind of shore yourself up prior to. So that's number one. Keep your trigger log, your Captain Kirk of your anxious emotions. And what's cool about this is, and this is number two, is labeling anxiety for what it is, calling it by its name, labeling panic as for what it is, and calling it by its name actually reduces by something like 30% the physiological response that you have in the moment. And so, for example, just the other day I was, where were we? I don't remember. But my son was panicking about something, And I said, dude, you're having a panic attack. I want you to say, I'm having a panic attack. And I had him repeat it. And just by labeling that, he started to calm down. So again, he was starting to get angry, but we were waiting for my husband. This is what it is. Sorry about this, guys. I know I'm rambling a little bit. We were waiting for my husband. He had texted to say that he was on his way. He was 5 minutes out. But what we didn't know was he had sent a second text that failed that said, oops, it's going to be longer than 5 minutes. There's a bit of a line. It'll be closer to 15. Well, we didn't get that. So the 5 minutes pass. My son starts panicking. Where's daddy? Where's daddy? Where's daddy? Then 10 minutes pass. He's still not there. He asked me to call my husband. I do. My husband doesn't pick up. And now my son's really freaking out. He's starting to pace. He's starting to cry a little. Full panic mode. And and then he starts to get angry. He's yelling at me, where's daddy? And he's just kind of yelling things over and over. And I'm like, dude, you're panicking. You're having a panic attack. I want you to say, I am having a panic attack. And he did. And then we did some breathing techniques. And I did the psychiatric sigh breath work that I taught you guys last week. And he started to calm down. And the reason this works, the reason labeling emotions work, is because you are starting to become the observer of your emotion versus being in the emotion. And there are people smarter than me that have figured this out. The people at UCLA in California ran a study and found that when people who are going in and having an active anxiety and or panic attack label their emotions, they start to notice the symptoms of that panic attack start to decrease within moments of labeling. So it's something about, it starts to switch the brain off of active fear and into more the observer role. And it's fascinating. And so when you're keeping a trigger log, you're doing that, right? Like you're noticing that you're triggered. You're labeling it by saying, going to the DMV triggers my anxiety. And so you're already doing that. So it's kind of like multitasking, which, I love. So you get a twofer with that one. Your trigger log actually helps to reduce those kind of anxious feelings, as well as giving you needed information on how to handle these emotions when they come up again, right? And now the third thing I want to talk to you is about how to get yourself back in the room, right? So when we're panicked or anxious, typically our brain is not in the room with us anymore. It has gone to a scarier, darker place than is actually in reality, right? Sometimes the anxiety is true. Like I do find like job interviews are stressful and are anxiety producing, and that's okay. But what we're talking about are these moments where, my husband was just late. Like he wasn't in danger. There was nothing to say that anything horrible was happening, but my son was no longer in the room. He was in, my husband's dead at the side of the road, and he's now an orphan, and he just has mommy and his brother, right? He's no longer in the room. When I got that college bill, I was no longer in the dorm at my mailbox. I was in bankruptcy court, never being able to pay a bill again and living on the streets, right? We're no longer in the room. So how do we get ourselves back in the room? Well, part of it is, we call it it's labeling what your senses. Okay. So we're going to stick with labeling this week. So we've labeled our triggers. We've called them what they are. We've labeled the emotion that is attached to it. Now we are going to label our senses, and this is going to bring you back in the room. So you look to discover something that you can taste right now. Like, for example, I still have kind of like the aftertaste of my coffee from this morning. I have a little bit of my mouthwash still on my breath. So I can taste that. What do I feel? I feel the chair underneath my butt. I feel my feet on the floor. What do I smell? I can smell this perfume that I got in Santa Fe. What do I hear? I hear my voice right now. So you want to label something for each sense to get yourself physically back in the room and connected to what is actually happening. And sometimes I have to label more than one thing to have it really work and have it really start to get me to calm down. So I may label like 5 things that I hear or 3 things that I see. It doesn't really matter. Play around with it, but it is really effective in getting you from, because you've teleported, your brain has teleported you into some dark, scary, multiverse dimension that is not conducive to thriving. And we need to come back from that place. And how you do that is by then labeling your senses. So just to recap, we're going to keep a trigger log. You're going to Captain Kirk that shit. You're going to keep a track of everything that triggers your anxiety or panic. And you're going to label every emotion around that. It's like, okay, when I hang out with my in-laws, I feel super anxious and I start to feel angry, or it manifests as anger. And so you're starting to label those emotions, right? And by labeling them, you start to reduce them, as we've learned. Thank you, UCLA. And then you're going to get yourself back in the room by then labeling your senses. And again, I start off with 1 of each. And if that doesn't work, I keep listing until I start to feel like, okay, I'm back in the room. I'm back home. I'm back here. And those 3, I think, are a good start. And I use them all the time. And I think that they should be a part of your tool set moving forward when you're dealing with chronic anxiety and panic. But that's all I've got for you guys today. I hope that was helpful. I will link to the UCLA study about anxiety and labeling emotions because I think it's fascinating. And again, I believe that knowledge is power, but it was super fun hanging out with y'all and talking shop. I will look forward to discussing stuff with y'all next week. All right, bye.